In 2001, Emma Watson brought to life the character of Hermione Granger, with her role in the film Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Hermione is a young witch who is a brilliant academic, a gifted sorceress who, despite being born to non-magical parents, is seen as one of the most outstanding students in the prestigious school of Hogwarts, a boarding school for witches and wizards. Alongside her friends Ron and, of course, Harry Potter, she defeats the evil Voldemort and saves the magical world. The Harry Potter franchise is one of the most popular in media history. The novels by J.K. Rowling are the best-selling book series in history, and the films have made even more money still, bringing in an estimated $9 billion worth of revenue. Overall, it is the 7th highest grossing media franchise of all time. The series features a whole host of other witches besides Hermione, and it's a common sight now to see young children, and adults for that matter, dress up and cosplay as their favorite Hogwarts houses and witches. But all of this goes much deeper than Harry Potter. Witchcraft is very real. Currently, there are millions of people around the world who identify as genuine practicing witches. In the United States alone, over 1 million people say they are followers of the religion of Wicca, which believes in witchcraft. But how did we get here? Go back a couple hundred years, and being a witch was something that would literally get you killed. Witches were burned, drowned, tortured in creative ways, and seen as agents of the devil. They were in many ways seen as representing everything bad women could do and be. And yet, witches have now become ubiquitous in films and TV as cute, powerful, and importantly, good people. Especially since the 90s, whether it's Hermione, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, or the charmed ones from Charmed, witches became a vibe, an aesthetic that came to represent coziness, comfort, and female power. I became gripped by this question: how and when did that shift occur? Well, what I found during my research was damn well fascinating, so indulge me as we take a little trip down the history of witches. It's hard to even define what a witch is, because witchcraft has been a concept for the entirety of recorded human history, and it's meant different things in different cultures. But this scene from Shakespeare's Macbeth is probably the most common understanding of what a witch traditionally was. Strange, magical, but sinister women who conspire to make bad things happen. To understand where this characterization of witches came from, we first have to understand the murky history of how witches were seen by people in Western Europe throughout the ages. As long as there's been human civilizations, there have been people who've practiced magic and what would be called witchcraft. Sometimes they'd be trusted as local healers or even kept in the courts of royalty. But inevitably, those who claimed to be wielding the power of magic were never that far from being viewed with suspicion. People were always afraid that the magic might be being used for evil purposes. And if that perception caught on, you were obviously going to be in a bit of trouble. The earliest recorded incident of a witch being executed is of a woman called Theoris of Lemnos in some 300 BC Greece. But the witch hunts that most people have heard about now, and where the term witch hunt comes from, is something that didn't occur until around the 1400s in Europe. Up until this point, witches weren't necessarily seen as evil or somehow going against Christianity, and it was actually relatively rare for someone to be executed for being a witch. They weren't a particularly fond part of society, but they weren't actively persecuted. But this all changes with the publication of a book called Malleus Maleficarum in 1486, which is usually translated as Hammer of the Witches. The title itself should give you a hint, but essentially this was a book by a German man called Heinrich Kramer, which was basically a manual on how to find, flush out, and punish witches. This book caught on like wildfire, and eventually became the official guide for how courts should handle witches, and the people loved it too. If you want an idea of just how popular this book was, according to some sources, for 100 years after the book's publication, it sold more copies than any other book in Europe except for the Bible. And it's kinda hard to beat that. Something new that the Malleus Maleficarum did was that it linked witchcraft with heresy, claiming that witches were working with the devil to bring down all that was good and right with the world, and particularly Christianity. After this, systematic witch hunts dominated Europe, and British controlled America for over 200 years, and thousands of people were executed for being witches. Tortured, burned, drowned, all sorts of horrible ways to be treated. It should be noted that men could be considered witches too, and many men were executed as witches throughout this period. But the signs of witchery became closely related to womanhood. Now there's obviously a lot of history here, but for the purpose of this video, I want to focus on some of the aesthetic myths about witches that came about during this period and how they're still with us today. The most basic image of a witch is one of an ugly old woman flying through the air on a broomstick and conjuring up magic potions. Well, let's break that down, starting with the broom. In the 1300s, a woman called Dame Alice Keitler was the first person tried for witchcraft in Ireland, and as they investigated her house, this was the account of what they found. A wafer of sacramental bread, having the devil's name stamped thereon instead of Jesus Christ, and a pipe of ointment wherewith she greased a staff, upon which she ambled and galloped through thick and thin. The staff mentioned here was a broom, and this particular image of witches seems to have been a thing from very early on. You can see the mention of the devil and the idea that witches were anti-Christian, but also reference to an ointment, which is what we might call a potion. The idea behind all of this is that witches were using local plants like nightshade, henbane, and mandrake to craft up hallucinogenic drugs. These drugs apparently cause problems during digestion if taken orally, so it was supposed at the time that witches were taking them through other holes. Witches, according to the accusations, would rub these ointments on staffs, like long wooden brooms, and then rub their intimate body parts up and down on these obviously very phallic objects, essentially to get high. These drugs would then give them hallucinations as if they were flying through the air, and groups of witches would be seen madly bouncing around in fields and gardens, thinking they were soaring through the skies on their broomsticks. Now, it doesn't take a psychological expert to see that this was all a thinly veiled fear for women expressing their sexuality. Women bouncing up and down on a long rod while laughing and high on drugs? I think some people might still be offended by that mental image today.
Right here, what we are watching is women fighting for the equal right to talk about their wet-ass
The fear that women might want or enjoy sexual acts is palpably strong in this image presented here. But this is what the people who hunted witches genuinely believed about them. It's also why witches were thought to operate in groups known as covens, because the idea of women conspiring together and encouraging each other's deviant practices was a powerful one. If you were on trial for being a witch, one of the best ways to get out of trouble would actually be to give up the names of the other people in your coven. After hearing all of this, you surely won't be surprised to learn that the people accused of being witches were usually those marginalized from society. They were widows, old women, unmarried women, and people who generally didn't behave well in society. If you got into an argument with someone and then the next day their cow fell ill and died, well, chances are you'd be accused of casting some black magic and being a witch. But a key part of the accusations were that they usually had to come over a longer period of time. If someone did suddenly accuse you of being a witch, it's unlikely you'd get tried and hung just for that. However, if over the course of 5, 10, 20 years you kept racking up accusations, well, that's when they'd usually come after you. And again, the kinds of people that this would happen to are the people who didn't play nice with the rest of their 30 people in their village. It wasn't uncommon that families would also be accused of passing down witchcraft, that so-and-so's grandmother was a witch and now she has inherited those dark arts. Remember this idea of generational witchcraft because it will become very relevant a little later in this video. Another traditional image of witches is the black robes and pointy hat they wear. Well, in terms of wearing black, this was likely a stereotype based on their association with black magic. The robes themselves would have been fairly common in the medieval period and beyond as just the style of fashion back then. But as scholar Catherine Walker points out, the connection with a black dress in particular is probably the result of the association of the color black with the devil and black magic throughout the Renaissance. The origins of the pointy black hat is unclear, but likely explanations stem from our old friend, bigotry. These were likely stereotypes attacking either Quaker women or Jewish people, marginalized groups who were thought to be more likely to be engaging in the dark arts and with whom the pointy hats were associated. And if you're wondering why witches are often portrayed as having warts or other blemishes on their skin, it's because these were thought to be the devil's mark. It was said that after a witch invokes her pact with the devil, he would seal the deal by leaving a mark on her skin, and witch hunters would frequently search the bodies of accused witches to see if they could find such a mark. This, combined with the fact that accused witches were often older women, is why we end up with the stereotype of the ugly old hag witch. So that now brings us to the media part, the main point of this video essay, and if you've made it this far, good job. We're now going to get to the interesting part. As I mentioned earlier on, the first and most famous image of witches is presented to us in Shakespeare's Macbeth, and it hits with all those things I've mentioned already. 3 women, a coven, conspiring together with their ugly appearance and evil intentions. They mix weird potions and chant incantations. They're the physical embodiment of all the witch fears that were flying around at this time. No pun intended. This perception of witches lasted well into the 1900s, when the witch hunts had long since been a thing of the past, and when witches weren't actively being persecuted anymore. They were still seen as forces of evil, bad women who were to be othered. So as you might expect, Hollywood absolutely ran with that idea. 2 of the earliest and most significant representations of witches are of exactly what I described: evil, conniving women out to do harm in the world. These came in the form of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs in 1937 and The Wizard of Oz in 1939. In The Wizard of Oz, we have the Wicked Witch of the West, the iconic image of a witch. As Dorothy, a young girl who gets magically transported to the land of Oz, learns, the Wicked Witch has been terrorizing the local population, who all live in fear of her. This is, of course, a perfect parallel to the view of witches we just spoke about. Scary, strange women who are trying to bring down society, and, of course, the witch lives far away at the edge of town, which keeps in line with the theme of ostracized women. Though there are good witches in the world of Oz too, notably Glinda, who helps Dorothy and her dog Toto, it is ultimately the Wicked Witch that dominates the movie and remains as the primary image we get of witches. And it's not a good one. The same can be said for the witch in Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. She does have something different going on in that she's actually a queen. Initially, she's shown to be very attractive, one of the fairest women in the land, but she is jealous, petty, and of course, an evil stepmother. And being a bad mother is another one of those worst things a woman can be type situation. So she heads into her little lair and conjures up a brew that transforms her into an ugly hag and then corrupts an apple so that it will put Snow White into a death-like sleep. Of course, with this being a Disney movie, her plan fails and Snow White is saved by her prince. But the image of the queen also taps into so many of those long-standing fears about witches, and maybe more relevantly, women. Where Snow White is sweet, simple, subservient, and a domestic goddess, what society says a woman should be, the queen is clearly ambitious, power-hungry, and concerned too much about her appearance, all the things bad women are accused of being. That is, after all, what motivates her to go after Snow White, who usurps her as the fairest woman in the land, according to her magic mirror. Perhaps even more nefariously, we're introduced to the idea of the witch living among us. That she may seem like a normal woman on the surface, but in her private little cave, she is secretly plotting no good. And of course, when she wants to do her evil deeds, she dons an image more befitting of a witch. An ugly old woman with warts and a crooked nose and a black robe. For decades, these representations remained as our primary understanding of witches in media. But over the next 80 years or so, this image would slowly change. And I want to run you through those changes, with each piece of media adding one small reversal of this image, till eventually we come to the more modern conception of a witch, which is much more favorable. This is where we must introduce the first major show that really starts to change the perception of witches: Bewitched. Bewitched was the sitcom that told the story of Samantha, a woman who comes from a long line of witches. Though she possesses those same powers of magic, Samantha falls in love with a mortal man named Darren Stephens and decides to settle down with this normal human. But he sets a condition, that she must give up her witchly ways and live life as his normal human wife. Thus ensues a bunch of shenanigans as problems occur in their lives, sometimes magical, sometimes normal, which Samantha inevitably tries to fight by secretly using her magic without her husband finding out. Sometimes to success, sometimes to causing herself even more trouble. Bewitched changed a lot. Firstly, it was wildly successful. In its first season, aired in 1964, Bewitched was ABC's #1 rated show and the best rated sitcom among all 3 major American networks at the time. Millions of people throughout America, and especially women, were watching this show and seeing a completely new presentation of witches, but also of womanhood. Critic Beth Spencer describes her experience while watching Bewitched in her article, Samantha, Every Which Way But Lose. Watching it, I never identified with the mortals. That was part of its magic. For half an hour once a week, you got to identify with a long-buried Wiccan heritage, another way of being, which men could be a part of too, but in which the feminine was supreme. The feminine, the queer, the magical, the eruption of the repressed rights into our lounge room every week. A lot of shows up until now had connected bad things with womanhood, but Bewitched was one of the first to connect the powers of magic and supernatural strength with femininity. It gave women watching the sense that there was something special that only they could tap into. Bewitched made being a witch seem like fun, like a cool power that led to some silly encounters and harmless hijinks. Of course, Bewitched had its flaws too. It's a show made in the 1960s after all. It's not a feminist landmark, and for all its progressive messages, there's plenty of regressive ones too. For starters, Samantha's husband Darren asks her to completely give up on being a witch, and she willingly agrees. Here was a woman with so much power at her fingertips, or more accurately the tip of her nose, since that's how she activated her powers. And yet, she happily let all of those go to please her completely ordinary husband. The show is both progressive and restrictive, a theme we will come to time and time again in this video. As Beth Spencer continues in her article, on one hand, it's the ultimate male fantasy of a woman who is enchanting, strong, and powerful, but would give it all up for love. And on the other, it's the suburban nightmare, the hapless man surrounded by mysterious, unpredictable creatures who have abilities beyond his imagination. A common occurrence in the show would be that everyone around Darren was meddling in his and Samantha's life with buttloads of magic, and he would be largely oblivious, at least early on in the show. Some aggrieved family member would try to make his life worse, or some problem would befall Darren, and then Samantha would take it upon herself to use magic to fix the issue. But of course, she had to do it secretly, so that her husband wouldn't find out and get upset. She was in control in many ways, and that was an appealing idea to the many women watching. And yet, she was never quite in charge. Time and time again, she would defer to Darren's wishes and do anything just to make him happy, often at the cost of her own wills and desires. But Bewitched moved the needle. It started to change the idea of what a witch was and what a magical woman could be. It ushered in an era of similarly superpowered women who were in some ways progressive, feminist icons, and in other ways still bound by the patriarchy. This was best summarized by critic Julie O'Reilly, who writing about Bewitched says the following: media and cultural critics have recognized the subversive aspects of the series. A woman of great power disrupting the suburban idyll and challenging patriarchy, although perhaps in limited and covert ways. Bewitched apparently set a precedent for sending mixed messages regarding women and power, as series featuring superpowered women that followed in the 1970s, prominently Wonder Woman and the Bionic Woman, offered the same frustrating blend of powerful women in restrictive settings and storylines. So this was the dilemma. We had on the one hand a progressive movement where women were being given so much more power on screen than they had before, literally. But on the other hand, that power was not enough to see them break out of the constraints that society put on them, especially men. But when we compare it to what came before, it was certainly a move in the right direction. And that's how it was viewed by the shows that would come after it, especially in the 90s, which is when the golden age of witches on screen really came about. But before we get into that, there is one other significant piece of media that I want to mention that connects those two periods. 1971 classic, Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Bedknobs and Broomsticks is a musical that tells the story of Miss Eglantine Price, a reclusive woman who is living in the British coastal town of Dorset during the Second World War. As part of the war effort in Britain, and this is historically true, children who lived in London and other urban areas were sent to live with foster carers in the countryside because it was safer than them staying in the cities, which were the targets of air raids by the Germans. Miss Price is given charge of 3 kids, Charlie, Carrie, and Paul. And while she's initially very unhappy about the arrangement, she of course grows to love them. There is a secret she's hiding though. She's a practicing witch. Miss Price has been getting lessons in the mail from a school of witchcraft and is aiming to graduate from apprentice witch to a fully fledged witch of her own. But because of the war, the school tells her that it's closing down and that they cannot send her the final spell she needs to complete her learning. Thus, adventures ensue when she takes the kids on a hunt to track down the school's professor and get him to give her the final spell, only to find out that the professor is a fraud. He's a street magician and a con man who had made the school up as a joke, but is shocked to discover that the spells he sent to Miss Price really work for her. When they realize that she's actually capable of doing magic, together they hunt down the missing book, which will teach her the last spell she needs to graduate, and that is a spell that brings inanimate objects to life. So then, to find the missing spell, they travel to an animated underwater landscape, enter a dance contest, and then get dragged above ground and forced to referee a football game between talking animals and smuggle away the medallion they need before escaping. Then they finally have the spell that they want to use, and they use it to fight Nazis who've landed on the shore and taken over Miss Price's house and are using it as their new headquarters. And then she animates a bunch of armor in the museum to form an army that defeats the Nazis and drives them back to Germany. Man, drugs were just more powerful in the 1970s, I guess. Anyways, what's cool about this film is that our main character is actually quite badass. She's the only person capable of using magic, even when no one else believes that witches are real, including the guy who gives her the spells. And she uses the power to fight evil and saves her country from the Nazis, which is pretty awesome. And on top of that, the film makes being a witch seem pretty great. There's no worry here that witchcraft is something evil people do, and Miss Price is clearly meant to be a good person. Also, this film contains what is easily the most accidentally hilarious line I have ever come across in any film ever, and it is worth it for that alone.
I was expecting a very important spell in the mail from my teacher, Professor Emilius Brown, and it hasn't come.
What's that got to do with my knob?
For any non-British people, knob in British slang means penis. So now that I've explained the joke, rewind this video 10 seconds and then watch that back and tell me it's not the funniest thing you've ever heard. Go on, tell me in the comment section. And while you're there, like and subscribe, and consider supporting me directly via Patreon since you've watched this far in the video already. And I'm a very small YouTuber who needs money for food. Thank you. There are, of course, still some problems with this film when it comes to our representations of witches and women. For starters, there's this weird sexist bit where she gets her first broom and the instructions explicitly tell her that it's unladylike to straddle the broom.
No, never astride the broom. Yes, of course. Technically, a witch is always a lady, except when circumstances dictate otherwise. Take an easy, graceful, sideways position.
Of course, because our main character is also clumsy and ditzy, she ends up having to do this anyways. But it inexplicably goes right back to what we spoke about during the witch hunts, with this idea that riding brooms was somehow a sexual act, and proper women wouldn't do sexual or even sexually suggestive things. And on top of that, the film ends with Miss Price losing her powers when the Nazis blow up her workshop. Instead, she adopts the children and falls in love with the fraud professor, who has to go off and help the war effort, but promises to come back and presumably raise the kids together as a family. So much like Bewitched, our powerful badass witch ends up giving up her powers to settle for being in a heterosexual relationship raising kids. Now, if that's not a metaphor for the patriarchy, I don't know what is. But again, progress. Progress is slow, but it's coming. And this is when we enter the 90s, and it all changes for good. The 90s is when a flurry of films and TV shows come out that turn being a witch from this horrible thing that evil women do into just being straight up cool and good. There are some notable films that I won't be covering much in this section in the interest of time, namely Practical Magic and The Craft, which were in their own ways very influential in making witches become popular. But instead, I want to start by talking a little about a cute kids show called Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Now, Sabrina the Teenage Witch is actually based off of a comic in the Archie Comics universe first released in 1971, which is a rather odd connection. But Sabrina wasn't really a cultural force until the television show was created in 1996. As the title implies, the show followed the story of a young girl named Sabrina, who on her 16th birthday awakens her magical powers and is told by her aunts, who are also witches, that she is a witch. Now, what's interesting about this show is that it's a lot more concerned about Sabrina's problems as an individual than specifically as a witch, though of course that is heavily involved in everything. The show's creators have said that they wanted to focus on her problems as a teenager, all of whom feel like freaks in some regard anyways. And to that end, the witch metaphor is super interesting. Particularly teenage girls in society often struggle with their sense of identity at this age, and that feeling of otherness is always something they fear. In that context, the use of being a witch as a literal reason to feel different and abnormal is actually genius. It takes back ownership of the history of witches and their persecution and reclaims it as a struggle that maybe all women go through in some way or the other.
Witches don't exist.
Honey, I know this is hard, but you just have to accept it. You're not like other kids. You're special.
I don't want to be special. I want to be normal.
Clearly, the idea worked. The show was a huge success. As Susan Orlean writes in her article Girl Power, the 9 o'clock Sabrina is watched by more young women, teens, and little kids than any other television program in that time slot. And both the 8 o'clock and the 9 o'clock episodes rank in the top 10 shows among all kids. For many millions of people, the embodiment of modern girlhood is Sabrina the Teenage Witch. While Sabrina was popular amongst kids of all genders, clearly young girls found its core idea to be hugely relatable. And for once, the idea of a witch was actually cool. Up until now, being a witch was mostly seen as a shameful act, one that indicated a woman who had something wrong with her or had been tempted by evil. For example, for Samantha from Bewitched, even her own husband was unhappy that she was a witch. The creators of Sabrina, on the other hand, explicitly wanted to change that and reference the show. Paula Hart, the executive producer of Sabrina and also Sabrina's mother, said in an interview that they wanted Sabrina to be different to Bewitched. Samantha had to use her magic on the sly, while Sabrina is encouraged by her aunts to use hers to the fullest. If we view the idea of witchhood as a symbol for feminine power, which it clearly is meant to portray in both TV shows, then Samantha is repressing her powers to make men happy. Sabrina, meanwhile, is trying to learn how to get as much out of hers as possible and is fully encouraged and taught how to do so by her 2 aunts who are raising her. But there is something bigger happening than just what we see on screen. We can't understand this show, or indeed any of the TV shows, outside of their cultural context. So we need to talk a little bit about the 90s. The best way to describe the 90s is that it was an innocently misguided era of presumed infinite peace. What I mean by this is that people genuinely thought that we had solved all the world's major problems, especially in the West. The Cold War was over, 9/11 hadn't happened yet, and the world had largely settled on the middle ground politics of neoliberalism. There weren't any major political frontiers to explore, social media didn't exist, and the highly divisive discourse of today was something that would be seen as unbecoming at that time. And importantly, there was this feeling that we had moved past discrimination. We were living in a post-racial society where we had now given black people equal rights, seemingly. Gay people didn't have the right to marriage, but they had other rights and were allowed to be more openly visible. And women were entering what we'd call third wave feminism. There was this pervading sentiment that we didn't really even need feminism anymore. Women had the right to vote and own property and to higher education. Women could aim to be the president, in theory. The role of feminism now was supposedly just small stuff, and the major battles were over. That was a microcosm of how the whole picture seemed at the time. All of this seems clueless now, and frankly hard to believe. But then, they didn't know Twitter was going to be a thing. So it is in this context that we get Sabrina the Teenage Witch. As Susan Orlean writes, Sabrina is independent, spunky, friendly with boys but not obsequious towards them, moderately athletic, unabashedly sentimental, and assertive in the way that only girls who have grown up taking feminism for granted are able to. For example, in the episode Ina Gara Sabrina, Sabrina and her entire world are transported back to the 1960s, where she is faced with various forms of sexism that existed at the time. She's told she can't be the editor of the school newspaper because she's a girl. She's told she can't attend university since those don't allow women. And she criticizes the school dress code that says girls can't wear pants. With all these examples, Sabrina vocally and boldly challenges all these wrongs. As you can see, these are pretty kid-friendly problems that she's facing, but nonetheless, they are gendered problems that she tackles. However, the implication behind all of this episode is that these kind of problems for women don't exist in the present day. It's probably fair to say then that Sabrina lives in an almost gender-blind world, where yes, sometimes she faces problems specifically because she's a girl, but she can bat them away with girl power. This was the era of the Spice Girls, after all, and the idea that you could beat systemic problems with the power of friendship was very much something that was being marketed and sold to young women around the world. This is part of what makes the show so powerful and influential, but it's also what some critics see as its weakness. Critics Sarah Projansky and Leah Vande Berg cover this topic very extensively in their book Sabrina the Teenage, Girls, Witches, Mortals, and the Limitations of Primetime Feminism. On the one hand, they applaud many aspects of Sabrina's character, stating that Sabrina often not only articulates a feminist or anti-discrimination position, but she also draws on her experiences of equality to enact self-confident and independent behavior that specifically represents girls/women as powerful. But they argue that being a commercial enterprise and mass-marketed primetime product first, it also doesn't push against the norms too hard. It still wants to keep the status quo firmly intact. They write, "The series' affirmation of traditional patriarchal feminine concerns with physical beauty, acquisition of heterosexual male attention, and responsibility for others undermines Sabrina's access to independence and contains her feminist potential as a role model." In many ways, the same can be said about a lot of the TV shows that came in the 90s. It was an unprecedented era of badass women on screen. There were mega hits like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Xena Warrior Princess, and while they were both lauded for their progressive messages, some also criticized them for not doing enough, or for still catering to the male gaze. This is when we arrive at the last major television show I'd like to focus on for this video, and there's a lot to say about it. If Sabrina the Teenage Witch was being watched by a large number of children, then Charmed was the witchly counterpart being watched by millions of adults. With over 7.7 million Americans watching the premiere of Charmed in 1998, the show shattered the record for the highest ratings ever for a Warner Brothers series, which was the channel it aired on. It was a huge success for a channel that was still then relatively new and trying to find its feet. Charmed follows the story of the Hallowell sisters, Prue, Piper, and Phoebe, estranged siblings who are thrust together by circumstance. In the attic of their childhood home, they discover the Book of Shadows, a text that their mother had left for them, which contains in it knowledge of spells, magic, and the family's history, as well as the revelation that the three of them combined are known as the Power of Three, the most powerful witches who have ever lived. The sisters each possess a unique power, and together, they are destined by prophecy to defeat demons, warlocks, and evil magic in the world. At the end of season 3, Prue dies and is replaced by a half-sister, Paige Matthews, thus keeping the Power of Three intact, as well as the idea of the Charmed Ones, as they are collectively known. Up until now, almost all the media we've discussed has been rather loose with what it means to be a witch. While they will often reference genuinely accurate imagery and themes for witches, Charmed is one of the first to authentically engage with the actual beliefs of witches, namely the religion of Wicca. Wicca is a word that derives from the Old English term witcha and witcha, which were the masculine and feminine terms for witch. It's hard, somewhat near impossible, to summarize the beliefs of an entire religion too quickly, so instead, I'll just say that it's the most popular religion in the world for those who believe in witchcraft and call themselves witches. It's estimated that there are somewhere around 1 million people in the US alone who describe themselves as Wiccans. We'll return to this later because this movement goes hand in hand with all the media we're talking about and why the perception of witches has changed over time. But for now, let's keep our focus on Charmed. The show's creator, Constance Berg, frequently spoke about her desire to use the religion of Wicca as her primary philosophical grounding for the show. And as critic Michaela D.E. Mayer points out, thus, the use of Wicca as opposed to general witchcraft used in The Craft or Sabrina distinguishes Charmed from other popular cultural depictions of witches. If we take a look at even just the first episode, we can see plenty of examples of how Charmed is a lot more concerned with being authentic to the idea of witchhood. Firstly, there's that Book of Shadows, which is an actual text used in the religion of Wicca, written originally by one of its most influential figures, Gerald Gardner, in the 1950s or so. In real life, as in the show, the book contains instructions and details of Wiccan rituals, a sort of manual for how to be a witch, if you will. On top of that, it's significant that the sisters find the book as something their mother left to them and intended for them to find. If you remember way earlier in the video, and the good beans amongst you will remember it because I told you to take note at the time, the idea of witch traditions being passed down is something that goes way back to the era of the witch hunts. In a negative way, it was thought that witchcraft, might be passed down from one generation of witches to another. Well, Charmed reclaims this in multiple ways. In Charmed, the Book of Shadows represents a proud heritage that the Charmed ones inherit, a secret power that only mothers can pass down to their daughters. On top of that, it reclaims the idea of the Coven, the conspiring group of women who gather to do evil. In Charmed, the three sisters are a force for good, and only when they're united do they have access to their full power, which is to say that female solidarity is a force of strength in their world, not the sign of evil. There's even various Wiccan rituals performed throughout the first episode. There's actually been loads of incredible academic study on Charmed, and I want to quote in particular from the book Investigating Charmed, The Magic Power of TV, which is a collection of essays analyzing various aspects of the show. These scholars speak a lot more eloquently on this than I ever could, and so I'd like to read a few key passages. In her article, Susan Latta writes, "The myth of the Charmed Ones provides viewers with an alternative interpretation of the role of strong women in society, one in which women can discover and reclaim a heritage of powerful women that has, until recently, been obscured." And she continues to write that it provides an alternative mythology of women empowered by words, women who can, quite literally, change the world through both the power of their actions and the power of their language. What I think Latta is saying here is that when we talk about heritage and tradition, so much of that is often focused on the contributions of men. Not a secret that the contribution women have made to society's progress is often erased, forgotten, or downplayed in favor of overemphasizing the role of men. The lore of the Charmed Ones, the prophecy that they are destined to save the world and that they come from a long line of powerful witches, changes that idea. It centers the sisters and the generations of women who came before them as the important ones, as part of a long tradition of women who shaped the world and its destiny. On top of that, media has the incredible power to give marginalized groups a voice where they previously didn't have one, to center themselves in stories they otherwise might not even have been included in. And so Charmed, both literally and metaphorically, creates a space where the words of women are powerful in shaping history, whether that's the text on a screenplay or spells spoken by the sisters. And it's even more significant that all of this is achieved through the vehicle of witchhood. As Latta continues, the symbol of the witch, used for generations as a derogatory term to stigmatize and sometimes brutalize women who transgress social norms, was reclaimed and presented as a positive image. The gender dynamics of Charmed are obvious from the get-go. And again, if we go back to that pilot episode, we can see how much of a threat men are in the world of Charmed. Almost all the antagonistic forces in the episode are men. First, there's Prue's boss and ex-boyfriend, who belittles her and steals credit for her work.
The Beals artifacts will now become part of our permanent collection. Which is why the board wants someone a little more qualified to handle the collection from now on. You look surprised.
I don't know why. I'm furious. Not only have I been on this project since its inception, but I'm the curator who secured the entire exhibition. You're the person a little more qualified, aren't you?
I could hardly say no to the entire board of directors, could I? But I know you'll be happy for me. After all, what's good for me is definitely good for you.
Bastard.
A source of pride for Prue in this episode is that she's able to break free from his exploitative behavior and quits, leaving him with a problem. For Piper, it's the stuck-up chef who's interviewing her for a job, who seemingly refuses to give her a fair shot.
Yes, without it, the sauce is nothing more than a salty marinara recipe from a woman's magazine.
I didn't have time for...
Despite that, she manages to use her powers to impress him and come out on top. Later on in this episode, it turns out that Piper's boyfriend is an evil warlock who is trying to kill the sisters, and whom the sisters have to come together to defeat, thus learning to seriously use their powers for the first time to defeat evil. Now, that's not to say that men are only evil in this episode or in the world of Charmed. For example, there's Andy Trudeau, who is Prue's childhood crush, who is portrayed as kind and helpful and does indeed assist the sisters throughout the first season until he too is tragically killed by a demon. What's important about the show is that womanhood is seen as something powerful and something that needs to display solidarity in a world that is often under attack from men in particular. That's not to say that the show is all about a gender war, nor is it above being superficial. As we discussed with Sabrina and the 90s vibe of girl power, there is plenty of attention paid to fashion and appearances and just looking sexy. Going back to our book Investigating Charmed, editors Karen and Stan Beeler write the following. Charmed focuses upon the empowerment of young women in a paradoxically sexy, yet decidedly third-wave feminist framework that challenges some of the assumptions of earlier forms of feminism, or what it means to be a powerful woman. Third-wave feminism does not necessarily recognize a contradiction between sexually attractive, fashion-conscious women, individualism, and traditional feminist ideals such as equality, collectivist movements, and empowerment in the workforce. Essentially, what's being said here is that in Charmed, and indeed in the entire era of 90s witchery, there was no contradiction between being a woman who cares about looking sexy with being a woman who cares about feminism and equality. Later on, they continue to say that while the Charmed ones appear to be feminine and fashion-conscious third-wave feminists who counter the second-wave feminists' interest in social and political change, they embrace some of the goals reminiscent of an earlier generation, a belief in the community of women, the expression of feminist spirituality, and the power of matrilineal connections. To summarize again, Charmed has a strong emphasis on collective empowerment. The Book of Shadows, for example, that shows a proud history of women passing power down to each other. And then there's the literal power of three that the sisters possess, an unbeatable strength that they can only access when they are all fighting together. There are harsher criticisms of Charmed too, as you might expect. There's actually a really interesting episode of the show where Phoebe, one of the sisters, actually references the show Bewitched. She tells her fiancé Cole that Bewitched was one of her favorite shows growing up because she thought Samantha was really cool. But she also says that she never actually wanted to be Samantha because she didn't like what becomes of Samantha in the show. Her husband gets to explore the outside world and go off and have a career, while Samantha goes from being a cool witch to just Mrs. Stephens overnight. On top of that, she doesn't like how Samantha's magic was completely repressed by her husband.
Darren completely repressed Samantha's magic, completely denied who she was, and it wasn't because he didn't love her, it was just, that's the way it had to be.
Her fiancé Cole is confused by this and asks, "And this was one of your favorite shows?" And Phoebe replies really tellingly,
Well, not that part.
"Well, not that part." I think that's a perfect way of looking at a lot of the media we've discussed so far. Some people criticize Charmed for some aspects that they find problematic, but not everything about a show is ever going to be perfect or revolutionary, especially if it's a primetime hit. The same applies to Bewitched and Sabrina and any other media you want to cite here. You can still take a lot of really valuable things from a show and love it nonetheless, even when you wish it did more. It can still be really inspiring and uplifting. And when there's things you're not 100% on board with, you can just say, well, not that part. So all of this is to say that I think Charmed is really cool, and I think it played a big part in changing perceptions of witches and womanhood alongside a bunch of the other media we've just discussed from the 90s. There was, for example, the 1996 movie The Craft, which was particularly popular amongst young women at the time, and talking to my best friend about it, she told me that as a kid, she and her friends would gather together and try to act out the witch rituals from the film for themselves, which I'm sure is a not uncommon story for kids at the time. Then there was Practical Magic, a 1998 film starring Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman, which was another significant part of this golden era of witches on screen. Though the film is kind of bad and weird, the entire journey of the film is that the two sisters who descend from a long line of witches, the theme recurring again, go from being seen as weird outcasts in their town to being accepted and celebrated by everyone at the end, specifically for their witch powers. In fact, we can see that as a microcosm of what occurs in the 90s overall, where the concept of witches goes from being viewed with skepticism to being celebrated and viewed as a vibe, as something fun, cozy, and empowering. And even when a witch's magic is being used for bad things rather than saving the world, it's still in a silly way, and not one that needs to demonize women, like in the 1993 film Hocus Pocus, which almost parodies those bad stereotypes of witches by making them so over the top, and turns it all into something so goofy that it loses all sense of threat, and it's probably why the film has become something of a Halloween cult classic. This brings us to the 21st century, the 2000s and beyond, when witches have become normal. As I mentioned at the start of this video, In 2001, we get the first Harry Potter film, and from that point on, Pottermania truly takes over, and there's no looking back. Hermione Granger remains one of the most famous witches in media history. But in terms of analyzing it for our purposes, there's not actually that much to talk about, because by the time we reach this stage, the reputation of witches doesn't need saving. In the world of Harry Potter, witches are just a thing. There's good witches, bad witches, and everything in between. In fact, the term witch doesn't really even come with any particular associations. It's not like the early days when it came with evil associations, nor is it like the media we've just looked at, where there's an attempt to use the term witch as a way to reclaim feminine identity. Witch becomes an almost scientific term, or we're just describing a woman who possesses magic, the way wizard describes a man who does the same. In many ways, this is a parallel to the feminist movements we spoke about in this video. We've reached an almost post-witch world, where the term can kind of mean anything, and people can own it however they like. And that's exactly what's happened. Across the world, the number of real people practicing witchcraft has been steadily growing every year. On social media websites, the witch lifestyle and aesthetic are both incredibly popular in their own right. Across YouTube and Instagram, there are influencers with hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of fans watching them as they discuss and describe their lives as witches. And on TikTok, the witch talk hashtag is incredibly popular. For reference, the Christian tag has 12.9 million posts, while the witch talk hashtag has 6.2, roughly half, which is incredible when you think about the relative scale and influence of those two things. And even amongst those who don't consider themselves practicing witches or religious in any way, there are several elements of witchcraft that appeal to them, none more so than the aesthetic, which has come to be viewed as comforting and beautiful, especially around Halloween time, where we see the greatest resurgence of witchery. So when we look at it, it's quite an incredible journey, really, of how witches went from this horrible, demonic, evil thing to becoming not just accepted, but seen as a symbol of power for particularly women around the world. Of course, it wasn't just media in isolation that caused this change. There have been several scholars, practitioners, and activists who worked hard and sacrificed a lot to change the image of witches. But it's also clear that the films and television shows we spoke about have had a big impact on the popular culture and helped change people's perceptions and associations, as media so often does. So what do you think? Are you someone watching who actually likes the idea of witchcraft for yourself? Or is it something that you've now understood from afar and maybe learned something new today? Let me know in the comment section, and do share with me what topic you'd like for me to cover next. If you've enjoyed this video, then please do consider supporting me directly via Patreon, since that allows me the weeks and months that it takes to research videos like this without fear of financial ruin. I'd like to thank my current patrons for supporting me, and you can see their names on screen right now. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.